Hello and welcome. I'm Rohit Gandhi and this is Democracy and Dictatorship. On today's episode, we're looking at the sustenance of our planet. The warning signs have been glaring at us for decades now. The rapid pace of environmental degradation our Earth has witnessed is still astonishing. We are here to talk about the declining natural resources and its impact on our existence. But we don't end there. We're also going to bring you stories of individuals who've been battling environmental injustice with peril to their life. The friction between big companies, environmental activists, and varying ideas on how best to save the planet has led to a lot of tension in the public space. It has even claimed the lives of some prominent activists. Our correspondent Manoj Kevalramani explores some of the recent environmental protests that have taken place and their fallout.
It is the greatest threat facing mankind. Rising temperatures, erratic rainfall patterns, and droughts threaten people's safety and livelihoods, while also posing a serious challenge to global food security. For decades, environmental activists have been urging governments to act, highlighting the nexus between corrupt leaderships and businesses. Earlier this year, activists around the world launched a series of protests against the use of fossil fuels. The Break Free series was the largest ever global civil disobedience movement against fossil fuels. In the US state of Washington, activists converged on oil refineries operated by Shell and Tesoro.
So we are here to draw a line in the sand and say that we are going to protect this earth for future generations. Enough is enough.
Well, we show that we have the power to stop fossil fuel transport. For 3 days, they suspended all fossil fuel transport through this region by tankers and rail.
Nearly 50 people were arrested in the police action that followed those protests. While events in Washington didn't really turn ugly, not everyone is as fortunate. A new report shows that nearly 900 environmental advocates have lost their lives in the past decade. 2015, in fact, was the bloodiest year in history for activists, with around 185 of them being killed in countries as diverse as Brazil, Colombia, the Philippines, Pakistan, and India, among others. In one of the most high-profile cases recently, in March this year, renowned Honduran environmental activist Berta Caceres was shot dead by armed intruders who stormed her home. Caceres had long faced threats to her life. Her killing sparked massive protests calling for justice. 2 months later, in May, police detained 4 people in connection with her assassination. One of them was the employee of Desarrollos Energéticos, an electricity company involved in the construction of a hydroelectric dam against which Caceres had campaigned.
Nosotros estamos diciendo que esa investigación debe alcanzar las estructuras económicas de la empresa, incluso la banca que está financiando estos proyectos. Entonces, justamente por el impacto que tiene el caso y por la ruta que tomó la investigación.
Months later, it now seems that the case is going nowhere. In late September, armed men reportedly stole the car of the judge in charge of the trial, making away with the original case file. For Caceres' supporters, justice is still a distant prospect. From the United States to Honduras, and even in India, climate change activists and defenders of land rights often operate in high-risk environments. Just this month, in fact, 4 villagers were killed in police firing in the Indian state of Jharkhand. This after protests against a thermal power plant over there turned violent. Incidents like these only further emphasize the very real dangers that activists face on the front lines in the fight against environmental degradation and the wanton exploitation of land resources. This is Manoj Kevalramani reporting from New Delhi for WION.
Protests and activities in the name of the environment aren't without substance. the danger is real. Erratic climate change, uncontrolled burning of fossil fuels, and emissions of harmful gases result in the Earth heating up. In an increasingly deteriorating environment, a 2-degree escalation in the temperature can change the game entirely. Our correspondent, Giles Gibson, will now explain how a minute difference can escalate climatic events.
Two degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but that's what climate change experts say could be the key to saving the planet. And the Paris Climate Change Agreement says global warming must be kept below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. World leaders hailed the deal's recent ratification as a turning point.
Today is a historic day in the fight to protect our planet for future generations. 10 months ago in Paris, I said before the world that we needed a strong global agreement to reduce carbon pollution and to set the world on a low-carbon course. The result was the Paris Agreement.
According to experts, crossing that 2-degree threshold would make low-lying islands like Tuvalu uninhabitable. But some climate change experts say even a 2-degree increase could be too much. They're calling for 1.5 degrees to become the world's new target instead. And the revised figure is attracting some top-level support. US Secretary of State John Kerry said last year that 1.5 should be a legitimate aspiration. And Canada's Environment Minister Catherine McKenna has also openly supported the new figure. While there's no complete consensus on global warming danger zones, environmentalist Neha Sinha told WION that 2 degrees is a realistic target that countries can work with.
I agree with critics that it's perhaps a little too less, but I would take a little too less over nothing at all. And I think the Kyoto Protocol failed because a few countries like the EU thought that they were following it and the rest of the developed world was not. And it was just too difficult, the emission cuts were too difficult to follow and nobody just did it.
Climate change talks over the years have repeatedly failed to produce a combined approach between nations. The world may not be able to agree on an exact global warming limit, but environmentalists will be hoping that this latest deal produces a combined desire for change. Giles Gibson, WION, New Delhi.
For a while now, we've all brushed aside the environment debate, mostly because the consequences weren't immediate and they weren't always visible. But look around you. The need to protect our planet has never been more crucial. In a bit, we're going to be joined by Erik Solheim, the Executive Director of UN Environment, and Ritwick Dutta, a prominent environment lawyer in India. We're taking this conversation further with them. More on Democracy and Dictatorship when we return after this break. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We're excited to have with us in studio Erik Solheim. He's the Executive Director of UN Environment. Also joining us is Ritwick Dutta. He's an environmental lawyer and has been representing some of the prominent cases in India. Thank you both for joining us. Erik, let me start by asking you, when we look at environment protests, even the peaceful ones, they're sometimes viewed as threats and mostly viewed as threats. Why is that?
That normally comes from a very wrong concept, believing that environment is hampering economic development or growth, rather than seeing exactly the opposite, that the most successful nations on the planet, let me make Germany as an example, probably no other nation has taken stronger decisions to protect the environment, and Germany is probably the strongest economy on the planet. So it's not that you remain poor by taking care of the environment.
Ritwick, we've seen lots of protests in India when it comes to the environment. We've seen people lose their lives literally in these protests. Sometimes police is used, sometimes companies, corporates. Why are they such a threat?
It's I think we have to say that most of the struggles don't necessarily call themselves as environmental struggles or protest. These are essentially movements to save one's livelihood, one's culture, the way of life, and therefore to the wider world it gets clubbed as an environmental or green movement. But in essence, it's about trying to save the last remaining forest, because on the forest depends your livelihood. India is the largest forest dependent community in the world. These wetlands, these forests, these are sustaining a huge amount of communities, and when these lands are diverted, whether for a coal-fired plant, whether for a highway, whether for any of the smart cities or infrastructure projects that are there, that's when the struggle comes in. There's a world mapping of environmental injustice, and India is number 2 after Colombia as the country with the maximum number of protests and struggles on environment.
The number of land and environmental activists that have actually died has increased globally 59% in 2015. Mm-hmm. How does that reflect on, and this has been by state or non-state actors, how does that reflect on the world?
There are some nations where it's really dangerous to be an activist for the environment, and we need to step up and protect those people. I will do everything in my powers within the United Nations to protect such activists. But I think the main issue is to change the view that environment is negative for the development, maybe negative for a few people, but for the broad group of people, taking care of the environment is positive by itself, but it also provides for rapid development. Take climate change as an example. Prime Minister Modi has now very, very bravely put India in the lead group on climate change. That's very good for India, because with climate change you may see a very negative flow of the river Ganges, for example, which will impact upon people along the river in a very negative way. May destroy their agriculture, may make livelihood very difficult. So clamping down, acting on climate change is in the closest interest of India, but it also is also a business case, providing many more jobs for doing this.
You know, India nationally is taking some of those big steps. But if you actually look at the record, on October 1st, 4 people lost their lives protecting stopping a coal mine coming up. Is there a genuine challenge of livelihood versus environment? And it actually is more of a livelihood issue.
We are essentially an agricultural nation, and that reality is going to be there for a very long time. We cannot, an industry has actually led to, and it's accepted that a jobless growth model. Right. And so therefore the dependence on agriculture, the dependence on forest, the dependence on flowing river is critical for the long-term sustainability of the people of the country. And as long as we realize that for a very long time Indians are going to be dependent on these natural resources for their livelihood. Even today, more than 60% of the medical requirement are met directly from medicinal plants collected from the forest. There is a very strong connection, and therefore whatever that we must do in order to develop must recognize this very close linkage to environment and ecology and the natural system. The World Bank itself today admits that 5.7% GDP loss has happened in India principally because of environmental degradation. That's the World Bank figure. It's not an NGO, it's not a Greenpeace figure. Now, if that is so, then we must recognize that India's development is only possible if we are taking proactive steps in order to protect the ecology. That's the only way to do it. And it is also a human rights issue. It's also an issue of democracy, because ultimately people have the right to decide the path of development they wish to take. And that is what is environmental democracy all about.
You know, there is a lot of laws around the world. Canada has something in place. New Zealand has something in place. Looking at environment, whether it's a river, whether it's trees, having rights of their own like human rights. Erik, give me a little sense of the view from the UN environment.
I think there is a strong case to be made that you may strengthen the global protection for the environment. However, the wisdom of the United Nations in 1946 when they made the Human Rights Declaration was much greater than we think. Because in reality, nearly all aspects of human life is covered by the Human Rights Declaration. It's about health, it's about education, it's about the right to political expression, and it starts with the right to life. Every human being has the right to life, and that's hampered by environmental degradation, as Mr. Dutta said. So if you destroy the environment, you are by itself violating the Human Rights Convention, since you destroy the right to life.
You know, way back in 2008, I was doing a documentary on Bangladesh, and a lot of people literally have to leave their homes because their homes are being flooded by the rising oceans and just overflowing rivers sometimes. The concept of climate refugees came out, and people said, well, I don't have a home anymore. I can't really live in Bangladesh. Where do I go? What do you think about the concept of climate refugees?
Well, it is a reality, and we'll see more of them, but I would personally use the word environmental refugees more, because yes, climate change is there, whether it's rising sea level or declining snow cover, which is shifting the agricultural patterns in the Himalayas. It's an issue of serious concern. But we must also not somehow forget that because of our direct action, not just because of climate change, but because of the number of hydropower projects or coal mining that is done, we are actually creating a huge class of environmental refugees. We have more environmental refugees in India than were the refugees that were created as a result of the partition in India.
Erik, looking at this whole Syrian refugee crisis, would you call them also climate change refugees in some ways?
I think, at least in many crises on the planet, it's very, very hard to distinguish between who is moving because of environmental degradation and who is fleeing because of war. Somalia may be a case in point to distinguish in the refugee camps there who came because of drought, who came because of terrorism, who fled because of environmental degradation is very, very hard, because people are fleeing from all these reasons at the same time. I think that's unfortunately what we may see more of.
We look at the United Nations Environment, then beyond that we look at other international organizations which are working towards the environment. Do you think the work today is effective? Are we being able to achieve what you set out to achieve?
Of course, I'm praying, working to my utmost to be more effective. But I think at the end there is room for optimism now. The big powers of the world, China, India, the United States and Europe, are moving on climate. They're moving decisively. And where there is most room for optimism is that this is now embraced by business. In many nations, business is well ahead of, not hiding behind politicians. And you see big business of the world seeing opportunities for new way of doing investment, new way of providing jobs, and then it will happen. So I'm optimistic that we will prevail, but it will be a hard struggle for sure.
The Paris Agreement has come into effect sooner rather than we were even expecting, I think. What initial adaptations do you think it'll go through?
I think that the main issue is to mobilize the citizens of the world, to put maximum pressure on political leaders and business to act very firmly. That's, by the way, also why I came to India at exactly this point, to take part in the huge beach cleanup, which is now happening in Mumbai, where citizens of Mumbai said, we cannot live with these polluted beaches anymore. Let's get rid of the plastic. Let us act. And let us then also get into a dialogue with business and politics, how to act. That's exactly what we need to see also on climate. Political leaders like Prime Minister Modi acting very decisively. That's fantastic. But also citizens' engagement in pushing business and politics.
We're going to take a break right now. More when we return. 3 million deaths worldwide due to air pollution last year. And you know, we are here in Delhi.
Not a single offence case has been registered under the provisions of the Air Act. So we have actually failed completely.
Prime Minister Modi knows very, very well how vulnerable India is to climate change.
Welcome back to the show. We've been in conversation with Erik Solheim and Ritwick Dutta about the challenges we face when it comes to the environment. Let me start by asking you, Ritwick. 3 million deaths worldwide due to air pollution last year. And we are here in Delhi, one of the most polluted cities of the world. How do we get past this?
It's very interesting. It's not very difficult to actually locate where the problem is. The National Crime Records Bureau has come out with the latest report of environmental offences in the country. Whether it is Delhi, whether it is Patna, whether it is Raipur, whether it is Firozabad, all those cities which rank as the top polluted cities of the world, not a single offence case have been registered under the provisions of the Air Act. So we have actually failed completely in implementing the provisions of the law. So anyone that is polluting, the action is essentially through public interest litigation in the Supreme Court or the High Court or the Green Tribunal. That is not going to solve the problem. It needs a proactive action by the pollution control boards. It requires a proactive effort by the government in order to actually make the polluters pay or to stop emitting all the pollutants that are there and actually to jail them for polluting it. And that's the most unfortunate part today. And therefore, despite us ranking so high in the pollution, Delhi, for example, in the last 2 years has not recorded a single offence case.
Ritwick, the challenge always was that the energy consumption was directly proportional to the per capita income, and that was one of the arguments made in the first few years as countries such as India or China were opposing the climate change agreement and the pacts. What has changed today? Do you think something has changed in the scenario that people are agreeing more with issues?
At a very country level, if you look at India, I personally think that there has been no change in the policy. We are promoting for the first time solar at very gigantic levels, but that has not really stopped us from depending on coal. So as we see increasing solar, there has been actually no decrease in dependence on coal. So conventional forms of energy is being promoted, and that's where the problem will be. We still regard, for example, hydro as a clean source of power without realizing that it is also emitting greenhouse gases. We regard thermal again as I sometimes differ that electric cars are not a solution because it is coming from coal. So we may not have pollution at the point of a city, but somewhere down the line in a rural area, someone is emitting it. Populations which are within 1 kilometer of a thermal power plant have 20% more respiratory problems than the nearby area. And therefore, we are actually shifting the pollution, and the burden is being taken by the poor in the country. So what is unfortunate is we are yet to see any change in the domestic action. And I want to be optimistic, but I don't see that happening because we are not putting the resources that are required to attain energy efficiency. Most of our thermal power plants and coal-fired power plants are operating at extremely low plant load factors. They are inefficient. We are losing a lot, almost 60% of the power, 40 to 60% because of transmission losses. We are not modernizing it, and therefore we are putting in more to open up new mines and set up new power plants and not investing in cleaning up and making the existing one efficient. So therefore, I would say that it requires us to be really more proactive rather than just saying that we are committed to climate change goals or aiming at meeting international targets.
Erik, this brings me to the point that organizations such as yours, the United Nations Environment, can they be playing the frontline role of bringing together these technologies together for developing countries and saying, all right, here is a solution that can help you go forward?
Interestingly enough, these technologies are now not just brought to the developing countries, they're developed by the developing countries. The biggest solar farm we have in the world is in Morocco. Very soon the biggest will be in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. The Chinese are bringing down the price substantially day by day. Half of all new wind power in the world is happening in China, not in the United States or in Europe. So it's in reality the developing world who has taken the lead on this now. And why is that? It's because the Chinese leaders know that they are more vulnerable to climate change than the United States of America. And Prime Minister Modi knows very, very well how vulnerable India is to climate change. And that's why he decided to ratify the Paris Agreement. He didn't do it for someone else. He did it for the Indian people. For instance, knowing that if we allow the glaciers in the Himalayas to melt, River Ganges and as well as the other big rivers coming from the Himalaya will be in deep trouble, and will have enormous impact on the livelihood of the Indians living along the Ganges. So I'm much more optimistic. I see a change in the attitude at the political level in India, and I see also an embrace of business, which will be at the end of the day, the main factor in the transformation of Indian economy in a greener way.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Ritwick. The challenge of the developing world is how to balance growth and still continue to move towards a sustainable future. Part of the challenge is convincing people that short-term gains may not be in the best interest of their long-term existence, because nothing is absolute.